Welcome to the Burnout to Lit Up podcast. I'm your host, Erica Del Pozo, occupational therapist, Miami girl, and founder and CEO of Joy Energy Time, where it's our mission to build a better healthcare industry by ending healthcare provider burnout. In these episodes, we'll discuss topics like stress management, personal and occupational well-being, energy, lifestyle, and more. You'll also hear from loads of healthcare professionals like you who provide us with their advice on burnout prevention and share ways that you can become your most lit up self. Ready to get started? Let's do this. Hey, and welcome to the Burnout to Lit Up podcast. This is your host, Erica, and I have two exciting things to share with you. The first one is the newly revised Stress and Burnout Guide for Healthcare Professionals. This is, I think, the third time I've revised this guide, and I'm so proud of how it looks now. It's so clean, it's so beautiful. All the information is the same, but it's just put together so much nicer, so it's easier to read, and I'm so proud of it. So we have that guide and also another separate guide for occupational therapists, and this guide is about 10 tips for using mindfulness with yourself and patients. So this second guide is shorter because the first guide, the stress and burnout one, is quite extensive. It's not 100 pages long, but it's really like a mini ebook, whereas this second guide is just 10 tips on how to get you started if you're interested in using mindfulness-based interventions with your patients. So the links for those two guides are in the episode notes and in the show notes. And if you haven't noticed, well, you probably haven't. It's like when you get a haircut and your partner doesn't notice and you're mad, like, hey, I just got a haircut. But anyway, we revised our website. So if you haven't noticed, then now you know. And again, we're just going through a lot of revisions this time of year, making things look better and bringing more value to you. So I'm excited about all these things. Be sure to check it out. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next guest. Virginia Sampson is passionate about the science-based message of the power of compassion to create success in all areas of our lives. She received her Juris Doctor degree from La Jolla, I hope I'm saying that right, law school in Los Angeles. She has been a practicing litigation attorney since 1982. Virginia started in the legal field when few women were litigators. She served as a judge over 3 years and currently practices elder law, helping seniors with their legal issues. Virginia has had a full and challenging life. She has been a full-time caregiver to her husband, who died from ALS. She was a victim of domestic violence, a single parent to 4 children, a widow, a divorcee, a step-parent, and more. Her professional and personal challenges inspired her to study and learn about the science of compassion, self-compassion, and happiness. She has completed courses of study offered through UC Berkeley Greater Good Science Center and Stanford Center for Care and Altruism. She has attended conferences and read extensively on the subject. She has also written a book for adults called Compassion Magic and started a children's series about compassion with Superhero Sam Saves His Family. Virginia writes for ThriveGlobal.com, the publication of Arianna Huffington. She travels nationally and internationally to speak about the power of compassion. She offers programs for individuals and small groups to assist them in developing compassion. Virginia provides information about the latest findings and research on compassion and happiness. She shares simple and scientific proven practices for discovering the power of compassion to create success and happiness in businesses, schools, communities, families, and even with our health and well-being. Virginia was awesome, so I'm really excited to share with you this interview. So welcome, Virginia, to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about your story, and you have quite an interesting story, and I just want to ask you about your story and tell us your how you got to where you are today.
Well, I got interested in compassion primarily as a result of my husband's illness. So when my youngest child was 2 weeks old, my husband was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. And I had three teenagers and him. And so I'm actually a lawyer, but I quit practicing law to take care of my husband full time. So I didn't find the world to be a particularly compassionate place during that period of time in my life, either for myself or for my children. And I emerged pretty bitter and disappointed and angry. And what helped me heal from that was compassion. And that's what sparked my interest. And other experiences in my life, I didn't feel that people showed a lot of compassion. So I started studying about the science of compassion, and that's where I got to where I am now. Having written a few books, not specifically about compassion, but about my journey with compassion. And I speak about it and I consult with people about it to help them find compassion in their lives or their workplace or their community, whatever it may be. So that's kind of the short version of how I got here.
Wow. So I know you have a history. You're a lawyer and you were a judge. So how has your journey been like in your professional life?
Wow. So when I started out as an attorney, so I graduated from law school in 1982. So that's when there weren't really many women litigation attorneys. We were kind of the first ones out there, and it was rough, I got to tell you. I'm sure a lot of people have experienced this, but we weren't welcomed, let's just say that. And it was really hard to gain respect, even to be recognized by anybody as having any value. So it was pretty tough. Yeah. I gotta, you have to be tough in that field in general, but I think especially as a woman starting out, you have to really develop a really thick skin.
Yeah. Wow. So I can imagine then and now we see all this, we've seen a shift in women empowerment and all this sort of thing. So have you seen in your industry how has that shift been like for females?
I don't do litigation as much as I used to. I actually help seniors now because it just kind of fits better with where I am in my life. But I see a lot more opportunity for women. I'm not actually in a law firm, so I don't know how the reality of equal pay and equal responsibility is. Mm-hmm. But there is certainly a lot of opportunity. I don't get the feeling there is discriminated, maybe perhaps in hiring, but I'm not really, in the day-to-day law field right now. So probably somebody in that would know more about it than I do.
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to what you said about you were a caregiver for your husband, what was, and that really started your journey with compassion. What was like the most difficult challenge during that time, and what were something that you were able to take from that and transform it into this work that you do now?
Well, wow. I think you feel very isolated when you go through something like that. Mm-hmm. You don't really have energy or time or interest really in socializing with people, right? You just don't. And people aren't particularly interested in socializing with you because, let's face it, your life is really a downer. Mm-hmm. So I think you feel very isolated, and that can lead to making the situation actually worse. And part of what I talk about when I talk about self-compassion is the feeling of trying not to remain isolated, right? Try to see what you're going through as part of a life experience, and other people are going through it. So you can kind of turn that around into something that will help you cope with it and relieve your stress. But, there's just so many challenges during caregiver, but that's a big one, I think, for caregivers, is a real sense of isolation, or anybody in an occupation where you're giving, you're giving a lot to other people and you don't have a lot of energy for yourself or for, social interaction in your own life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were recording, we were talking about healthcare professionals, and that's my audience for the most part. So I can totally feel or relate to what you said about that, because burnout starts from just being emotionally exhausted and feeling like you can't really give any more of yourself, because you're depleted. Would you say that there's an emotional exhaustion component to that?
Yes, yeah, that's what self-compassion. And so I speak a lot about alleviating burnout to caregivers and other groups. Yes. So when you start to feel, very alienated and very isolated, and everything's kind of depersonalized, you don't really even see people as people, that usually means the first symptoms of suffering some kind of burnout, or, psychologists call it secondary stress trauma. You're depleted. You've given so much away, and you haven't really taken care of yourself.
Mm-hmm. Right. I want to ask you about the root of compassion. What is, I know you say self-compassion. Does that, if someone is experiencing burnout, either through caregiving or working in, like you said, a job, for example, healthcare, where they're giving a lot of themselves, what is compassion exactly? Like, and do you start with the self-compassion first before you can give to others?
I think so. Well, I think it's a big component of it. I don't know that that's the people who are caregivers and in the healthcare field, I think, are already probably pretty compassionate people, right? Or they wouldn't go into that field. They want to take care of others. They want to give to others. So I think their weakness lies in self-compassion. So there is two types of compassion. We have the compassion for others, and we have self-compassion. Compassion for others, again, I think healthcare workers have down for the most part. That's why they go into that field. But the self-compassion, where they need to be compassionate toward themselves, is what they're lacking. And so compassion is basically defined as you notice, or you're aware that somebody else is in distress or suffering. It doesn't have to be, a terrible suffering. They're just in some distress. They have some need, and you are moved to help them. Mm-hmm. And so that's where it differs from empathy. So compassion has an element of help to it. And of course, it doesn't involve any judgment. And I think that's part of the problem with self-compassion as a healthcare worker, or even anybody who gives a lot in any profession that they're in, is that we're not non-judgmental toward ourselves, right? We tend to criticize ourselves and judge ourselves against some kind of an impossible standard. So one of the first things that we work on with self-compassion is to be kind to yourself, and to find expressions, affirmations for yourself that make you feel good. And a lot of that helps fill you up. There's other steps to it too, but that helps fill you up. It can even make you more resilient to stress when you practice self-compassion on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's interesting. I went to this self-love, it was this not even a workshop, it was sort of like a panel of speakers in this little event, and they were talking about, you would never say the things to yourself to someone else. That's how judgmental we are of ourselves. So how does someone go about, either in any circumstance, how do they go about breaking that?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to be aware of it, right? So part of self-compassion is being mindful of a lot of things, where we are, what we're doing, kind of being present in the moment. And I think when you start being mindful, you start to be aware of those messages that just rotate through your head. I know I had a hard time with this. My mother was very critical. And so you almost think that's just kind of a normal way that people talk to themselves. I didn't even think about it. I was just so used to hearing that in my head. So I'd say the first step for people is to try to slow down and listen to be aware of what you're actually saying to yourself, right? Because you have to be aware of it before you can fix it. So I focus on that in the beginning, and then try to find things that when you start talking critically, things that are more affirming for you to say, right? Like, I don't know if you're taking care of someone and you feel like I could have done a better job. You could say to yourself, I did the best I could. I helped them. Turn it around in something positive. Focus on the positive you're doing rather than maybe the negative that, none of us are perfect, so we're not doing it exactly right.
Yeah, yeah, none of us are perfect. Exactly. And sometimes I say to myself, if I feel like I've had a pretty bad day, I would say I did the best I did for today. And it kind of frees you because you're is that a form of self-compassion?
Yes, yes, you part of self-compassion, and part of compassion, it's another element of it though, is forgiveness, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we have to let go of the perfect caregiver, the perfect therapist, or whatever the perfect person is we think that somehow we're measuring ourselves against. Yes, that's part of it, is you want to just say, as you start saying those messages and criticizing yourself for all the things you didn't do right, I did the best I could today, and I did do some good today.
Right. Acknowledging that you did do some good, and acknowledging that you are doing your best, that there's never anything that's perfect. I worked with a family that they had a they had a child with special needs, but this was different because I worked in the pediatric field for so many years, but this was a patient I saw at home versus at the clinic. Because it was way more involved physically, cognitively. The case was just more involved. So it was best if I went to the home and treated. And I just, watching and observing the caregivers, her parents and her siblings, I was taking notes and observing to see if there was any caregiver burnout. And from me going into the house, everything looked fine. But what are some signs that either you or someone could be experiencing caregiver burnout?
Well, I think if you feel like kind of emotionally dead,
Mm-hmm.
do you know what I'm saying? Like if you just, you just feel you're kind of just going through the motions. I think that's one thing. I think if you're not feeling any emotions at all, right? You're not feeling joy, you're not feeling sadness, you're just feeling like, okay, another day, here I go.
Mm-hmm.
You're that's part of it. Starting to see the person you're caring for is just a case.
Right.
Not a person with feelings as part of a family, or I'm not saying you go through all of that every time and see them, but you kind of depersonalize them when you start to have some trouble in your relationships, right? That's another symptom of it. Just depression, those things. You're not getting along in your personal life with people in your personal life as well as your professional life is another symptom.
Yeah. Yeah. And have you ever witnessed or attest to someone experiencing caregiver burnout and they perhaps take it out on others, or any anger involved?
I do think that happens. Yes, I think you have much less patience.
Right.
Right. So things that normally, if you weren't exhausted or stressed out, you would deal with it in a better way. Yes, I think you can be less patient, and then that can always lead to anger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So less patience could come from giving yourself so much to be a caregiver, and then maybe not feeling energized, or you feel depleted.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And you're kind of cynical. Like I said, you feel disconnected from your loved ones. You can even feel less safe in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Anything. Yeah. All those negative emotions are part of it. But, basically you're emotionally exhausted, right? And you also don't feel like you're doing anything good. You feel a sense of low personal accomplishment. I'm not really doing any good. What am I? Those kinds of things. Those kind of doubts also can be part of feeling burned out.
Right. Right. So are these things that you experienced firsthand that led you to become so involved in this work around compassion, and then you were or someone else were the student, or not the student, but like you learned from yourself and you learned how to practice compassion from your own experiences?
I think, when I was going through my caregiving experience with my husband, there wasn't as much research and as much information available about compassion, self-compassion. But I do, definitely experienced all of it. Anybody who is a caregiver or who gives a lot to anything that they're doing, right, whatever your profession is, can experience this. So sure, I've seen it with friends. I see it with clients. I deal with seniors now, and maybe they have a family member that's caring for them. I see it with them a lot. And I think part of it is you feel bad saying anything, right? So if you're caregiving or if you're helping someone like you do and someone's not in very good shape, you almost feel kind of bad complaining, don't you? Because you look at the people you're taking care of and you're like, oh, wow, I have it a lot better. Mm-hmm. And I think that can kind of add to not recognizing how you feel. I mean, you have to give yourself permission to feel things, right? And other people may be worse off, but that doesn't mean that you can't take care of yourself and that you are not going through a difficult time yourself.
Right. So, okay. So you hit on a very interesting point. I know we've been talking about the self-awareness and the mindfulness to begin practicing self-compassion. What would be an energizing routine or a routine that someone can start that would empower them to begin self-compassion?
So there's really some simple things that you can do. One of them, so these are scientifically proven practices that the experts in the field have developed. Mm-hmm. The simplest one is probably taking a self-compassion break. So what you want to do is and it can be really short. That's why I like it, because people who are busy or taking care of other people don't have, 30 minutes to meditate or do other things, right? So I like to say take a self-compassion break instead of a coffee break. So when you start feeling, kind of stressed or emotionally uncomfortable, I mean, you can feel it in your body, right? Your shoulders get tight. Then you need to stop for a minute and say to yourself, whether you've gotten angry at someone, whether you can feel your shoulders tightening up, whatever it may be for you personally, you start and you say to yourself, this is a moment of suffering, right? And that's part of the mindfulness piece. Other things you can say is, this hurts, this is difficult for me, whatever calls up how you're feeling, because you need to be aware of how you're feeling in order to heal it and to move past it, I think. Mm-hmm. So you start with being aware of how you're feeling. Because, especially as caregivers or in your field, you kind of stuff down how you feel all day. You're dealing with difficult people, and then it kind of explodes at the end of the day, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying you can do this all day when you're seeing patients, but, and you'd say to yourself, then the second part is suffering is a part of living, right? There's people, this is what goes on in life. Other people feel this way. I'm not alone. We all struggle in our lives. This is temporary. And those are good ways to comfort yourself. You can also put your hands over your heart or wherever it feels soothing for you and say to yourself, may I be kind to myself. Something that comforts you. Other things can be, may I accept myself as I am. May I give myself the compassion I need. Whatever works for you. May I be strong. May I be safe. May I forgive myself. Whatever you're feeling at that moment, you want to offer words of comfort to yourself. So it's three parts. You want to recognize your suffering. You want to keep it in perspective, right? This is part of life. This too shall pass. Everybody goes through this. And then you want to offer yourself some comfort. And you can do that in less than 5 minutes. And that is a practice that's been developed, that's been scientifically proven to help people deal with burnout and alleviate it, and also help prevent it, because you're building yourself up. I mean, there's lots of other things you can do, but I think this is the simplest to start with. If you're having a total meltdown moment, you just have lost it for whatever reason, the best thing to do, I think, is give yourself a hug. Mm-hmm. Right? If nobody's around to give you a hug, hugs actually release oxytocin, which is considered to be the love hormone. It actually soothes you. So I would say, you can give yourself a hug. That's a good way to do it in a time of crisis. But this is a practice that if you do the self-compassion break, if you do it, and some other things, that it's going to start building you up. Even 5 minutes of just paying attention to yourself and how you feel is very nurturing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for, someone can hear this and think it's simple, but it is simple, but it is so empowering, because how often do we stop and do this? And for me, this was probably the biggest thing when in my burnout story was self-compassion and forgiveness. And that really, I think, laid the foundation for me to achieve other things. So I think it's probably just the best thing that you can do is to practice that mindfulness.
Yes, I agree. I mean, and you'll be surprised that if you just do little bits, it does build. It does have a huge effect on you. It sounds simple, but it's very powerful.
Very powerful, exactly. And you know what? Like thinking about this and thinking about my old patient, when I saw that her parents, her caregivers, gave themselves permission to enjoy, for example, like a long weekend away from home. And I noticed that the parents equally had responsibility of caregiving, but they also gave themselves and each other permission to do things that are meaningful to them. So do you find that people don't give them permission to enjoy anything outside of caregiving?
Yes, I think that people start feeling guilty and they don't do it. And so when I talk to people about alleviating and preventing burnout, I remind them that if you do this, you will not only help yourself, but you will actually be a better caregiver. So when people receive compassionate care, they actually recover more quickly, including from surgery.
Wow.
They have stronger immune systems. This goes for us too, practicing compassion, but the people that we care for, compassion is a really important element, not only psychologically, but also physically. There's a huge mind-body connection between how we feel and what happens in our body. And the same is true for people we're taking care of. We kind of emote things to them that they then kind of internalize. So there's a lot of really good examples of things that can what can happen when you are a caregiver who practices self-compassion and then is able to offer compassionate care to whoever you're caring for. And that's whether you're a therapist or a full-time caregiver. It's just anyone in that field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've seen, well, I'm very involved on Instagram and social media, and sometimes not completely different, but in another area of moms caregiving for their children, I've seen some backlash I've seen some backlash for moms that, and this is through comments. So again, this is kind of like throwing stones when you live in a glass house. Like no one's perfect, but I've seen comments of, moms should, like, I don't even know where to begin. Just basically that they're not doing enough of their caregiving. They're not a good enough caregiver because they're going out without their children, or they just had a baby, but they're, I don't know, going outside for a walk and they should be at home. I don't, like, just the simple, like almost like the most just the craziest things that's like that I've seen. So can you talk around like that sort of judgment?
I think that's a big part of our culture. I think that's part of our problem, right? We're always comparing and judging and criticizing people. And it's terrible for the people doing it, and it's not good for the people who are on the receiving end of it. But yes, that's a cultural thing that I think we just have to work to get away from. I don't know whether there's an insecurity that people feel that they have to compare themselves to you and, whatever it may be. But yes, that's a big problem, I think, in any field, but certainly as caregivers. And I think we need to, and in compassion, there's no place for criticism or judgment, right? If you're judging and criticizing, you're by definition not being compassionate. And I think the goal is to change the conversation to where we show compassion to each other rather than judging and criticizing each other. And some of those people maybe, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but it seems to me if we're showing compassion to ourselves, it's going to be easier for us to show compassion to other people.
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
These are messages they've heard, or maybe they're not practicing compassion themselves, so they get angry when other people do. I mean, like I said, I'm not a psychologist, but I think if we could practice self-compassion, be filled up ourselves, we'd probably be less likely to judge and criticize other people for how they're handling it. Because, everybody handles these situations differently. We need to recognize that. We are all different. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a hard part is we have the standard of the perfect caregiver, right? And then if you fall short of that, you either criticize yourself or somebody else is criticizing you. And I think it starts with we are different people and we're going to all respond differently to this. And we need to honor that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Actually, the thought just came to my mind. I've seen both ends where moms are criticized not for not looking put together, like they look like a hot mess. But then I've also seen on the same, like on the other end, that moms are criticized when they look like they're two together. So it's hard because you cannot please people. So I think it's like regardless of how you look, it's in that other person to find a fault and criticize your caregiving skills based off of your appearance, which I think is, like you said, like that's the world we live in.
Yes. Well, I mean, we just think generally, we always judge people by appearance. And if somebody looks really put together, maybe that's how they take care of themselves. I mean, that's their relief from the caregiving. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, people need to escape the caregiving. You can't do it 24/7 forever. So maybe that's what soothes them and takes them out of it and helps them be a better caregiver. We don't know. Like I said, it's just different for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we need to honor and respect that.
I agree. And that's what compassion is about, is honoring the other person, just wanting to help them, not judge them.
Yeah, that's so key, the whole judgment part. It's speaking about other people in the world, like how can we go about showing and teaching compassion to others in the world? And just being in California, this is a little off topic, but I'll be walking through the grocery store or any store and no one holds the door for me. And I'm very used to that. And that's not compassion. I know that's just cultural expectations, but that just kind of reminded me of what in the world where people can, like just basically how can you, and, oh my God, so not related. I just had to say that. But how can you go about teaching compassion to others?
No, I think it's really important because, we need to live in a compassionate world in order to survive and certainly to thrive. I mean, the researchers have established that. And I do think holding the door open for someone is an act of compassion, right? Somebody needs help and you're going to help them. And I think the best way for us to do that is to model compassion, right? To be compassionate, because compassion is contagious. It's like a pebble in a pond. So when you offer compassion to someone, they're more likely to offer it to someone else, and it just spreads. So, you really can't say to someone you're not really compassionate. I think you have to show them, especially children. I mean, we know when you have children, it's like living in a fishbowl, right? It's not do as I say, it's do as I do. And it's really important that we model that. And I realize that in our world, we think compassion is just kind of this fluffy emotion that, we have for church or volunteer work, but it is an integral part of who we are. It's part of our biology, and it is part of the way we will survive and thrive. So it's essential to us. And I think we need to change the conversation around compassion and caring. And manners are just a part of compassion. I think it's just part of respecting other people that we live around, right? We care about what's going on with them. We want to help them, even in the smallest way. And so we need to change the conversation around compassion, get people to realize how important it is. I mean, it's actually really good for your health. I try to get people inspired to live compassionately by talking to them about their health, because it really reduces stress and anxiety. It helps you live longer. It helps you recover from disease. It boosts your immune system. I mean, there's a huge, it prevents inflammation, reduces cellular inflammation, which we know is the center of a lot of diseases, including certain types of cancer, reduces your heart rate and your blood pressure. So, if we can start the conversation around that and we can get people interested in compassion because I think it's good for them, it will spread. But like when I go out in the morning, I try to remember, I think it's part of our busy culture too, I try to remind myself that think about putting a compassion cap on, right? My goal today is not to get, the 50 things done on my to-do list, because that will never happen. But my goal is to be compassionate and kind to everyone I meet during the day.
Wow.
And I think if we could change our focus to that, the world would be a much better place.
Yeah. Amen. That's so true. I love what you said, because I'm so focused on my to-do list. But I think I've gotten into a habit, hopefully it will strengthen, that I smile at people and be kind to people and show people, like you said, be a model of how you would like to be treated. So what are some steps that someone can take to show compassion? I know we said being kind. Is there anything more to that?
Right. So it just depends on who you're interacting with, right? So if you are interacting with someone in your life, other than, at the grocery store or something, one thing that you can practice with people is called active listening.
Yeah.
Right. And that is also an art, but there's certain steps involved in really listening to someone. And of course, the experts have developed practices for this as well. But you want to actually, instead of, which we tend to do, again, we're all busy, we're all thinking about our to-do list, right? We often listen without really hearing what the other person is saying to us. So the point of active listening is to help you express an active interest in what the other person is saying. So to make them feel heard, right? And that fosters empathy, compassion, and a connection with them. And at the root of compassion, one of the reasons compassion is so important in our lives is because we create meaningful connections through compassion. And we are, like I said before, biologically programmed to connect with other people. Mm-hmm. It taps into our deepest human need. So when you do this active listening, you're actually creating a connection with them. I mean, it can take as little as 10 minutes, but you want to find an uninterrupted place to talk to the person, right? There's a whole bunch of steps to it, but you want to lean in. Body language is important as you're listening. We want to not be thinking about what our response is going to be, as what we're going to say or how we're going to solve their problem, because that's not what they want. They want someone to listen to them. Sometimes you can repeat what they've said so you understand them, or ask appropriate questions. You want to express some empathy for them. And again, you want to avoid judgment, right? I mean, nobody wants to be judged. And really, for the most part, I think we all tend to give advice, but that's something you typically don't want to do either. People don't necessarily, if they want you to help give them some ideas, they'll ask you. But that can tend to cut off the conversation a little bit. If you start giving them advice, it's kind of like, I know better than you, and here's what I think you should do, right? So you take turns talking, just the art of conversation. And that's a huge part of the people closer to you in your lives, or even the people that you work with, a huge part of developing a connection with them and empathy with them, because you're really giving them your undivided attention for what is going on in their life.
Wow. Yeah. Active listening. I just, this past spring, I was an adjunct professor in Florida. This was my third semester, but it was our first class, my first class teaching this course called Human Interactions. And we learned the art of basically what you said, active listening. And we were talking about, as occupational therapists, how this sort of class needs to be taught in other fields, because when you know when someone is practicing active listening versus just writing you off or just assuming they know about your pain or your problems without active listening. It is such an art, and I really think that to be interesting, like I used to worry in the past about being interesting to people, so people would like me. And then I realized over the years of doing personal development that to be interesting, you have to be interested in people. And I think that comes with the active listening.
Yes, I think that's such a profound observation. It's so true. You really do. People find you want to. I mean, we all want to be liked, and I think a lot of us were socialized that, especially my generation. But yes, you want to be liked, but the idea that you can actually listen to someone is the greatest gift you can give them. And of course, they're going to think a lot of you in return for that, because it's a gift.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, yeah, exactly. So in terms of practicing compassion in the world and with the people you interact with, being kind, showing active listening, is there any thing about giving versus taking, like give more than what you expect in return? Is there any of that ideology behind compassion?
Right. So you want to help people, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to, even in simple things, you want to find out, what it is that they may want help with. I mean, that is part of it. again, just listening to people. I think it's just an attitude of caring about people. I think if you just show that you care about people, a lot can happen. And it's okay to have people give back to you too. I don't know if you have to give more than you receive, because then you might be depleting yourself. But I think it's just the act of showing some kindness and love in the form of compassion to other people is just really, really powerful, they've determined. I mean, one thing that I do every morning is this loving kindness meditation. And that really, I think, helps you focus on, it nurtures you, it provides some self-compassion, but it also kind of gets you in the mindset to be kind and considerate of people as you go through your daily life. And that's just something simple. It can be as simple or as complicated as you want it to be, but just the general idea of it is that you close your eyes and you imagine people in your life. They don't have to be, alive still, but just sending you love, right? They're sending you love. You feel filled up, and then you start sending love to people in your life, whether it's your spouse or your kids or your neighbors, and then you go out through layers of people that you know or places to where you send love to the whole world. And it's very powerful. It's very, very powerful. This is another meditation that they've discovered is very powerful, that they've researched. And there's lots of things you can say as you go through this. Like I said, you can make it very simple, or you can make it very complicated. But the idea is that you start the day receiving love and giving love.
Yeah, you know what? That's funny you say that. I've read studies on that specific meditation, and there's been, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it was that meditation that showed to be beneficial for nurses, I believe. So I'll have to find that article.
Oh, I'm happy to send it to you. Oh, yeah, that'd be great. And I'm happy to send you one version that I have of it. So all of the I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. All of the experts in the field all have a certain version of the loving kindness meditation. I have a couple that I've gotten from some of the experts, and I'm happy to share that with you or anybody else who would be interested in it. And again, you can adapt it, and there's other versions of it, but this is a good one, I think, to start with.
Yeah. Send me all the resources that you're talking about, and I'll put it on the show notes. And you know what? I want to think about that phrase I said, give more than you receive. I think energy is an exchange. So you give and you receive, and you need both to be your highest self and to show up better in the world. So it is an exchange of receiving love, giving love, and knowing where how to set boundaries for yourself so that you can give better.
Yes. And it is interesting, when you are compassionate, it does nurture you too. Even if the person that you're showing compassion to isn't necessarily compassionate back to you, it's a cycle of nurturing, because you will get benefits from just giving compassion, even if you're not receiving any in return. So that's good to know too, because I know sometimes we're nice to people and they're not, and you get kind of like, well, what was that all about? Do you know what I mean? We get a little mad, and it's like, well, that's terrible. But if we can try not to go down that road, and just remember you've gotten benefit from being kind and compassionate to them, and I'm talking psychological and physical benefits as well. When I say benefits, so just keep that in mind when somebody that you want to offer compassion to doesn't necessarily reciprocate it. You are still getting a benefit from that.
Right, and it shouldn't deter you. I think people sometimes they have, if they're not showing compassion back, I think, and what I've seen, it's probably a sign of pain that they're going through something. So it's even more so that you should show compassion to them.
Right. You don't know what you're going through. And I think people too, like you were saying, something simple like opening the door. People don't open the door. But I think if you open the door for somebody that just doesn't even acknowledge it, I still think that affects their psyche in some way. At some point in time, they're going to be aware of people doing kind things for them. So, we may not get a response immediately when we do that. But again, you get a benefit. But I do think somewhere down the road that has an effect on that person.
Yeah. Actually, I do this little psychological trick that I made up, and this is a really silly example. But if we're out, like my husband and I, and we see a family taking a selfie, I offer to take their picture, and 9 out of 10 times, well, I think 10 out of 10 times so far, they're so appreciative, and then they make an effort to take a really good photo of us. So it's like I like to give when I can. So it's one simple way of compassion with strangers I've been practicing lately.
Yeah, and doesn't it give you a little boost? Don't you feel better after that interaction?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, you feel a connection to someone. You've done something nice. Somebody's done something nice for you, and it puts you in a better mood.
Yeah, I think it could be a chain effect, like you said, and we open the possibilities for others to say, oh, I can do that for other people. And it could be in those small ways. And I think that's what those small little actions make a big difference at the end of the day.
Well, and I think too, when we practice small actions, when we do that, then I think we're ready for the bigger things, right? If somebody in your life has a crisis and you're kind of already in that frame of mind, it's going to be, I think, easier for you to respond to that, at least in my experience, than if, you're coming from a place of anger and then somebody lays their heart out and you're kind of like, whoa. I think it just prepares you. It just keeps you in that mindset. And so when something does happen that requires compassion, I think you're a little bit more capable of giving it promptly. That's just been in my experience. That's one reason I didn't like being a litigation attorney, is because it had become so ugly and negative. I didn't like who I was becoming, and it was very hard to turn that off. I think men are better at that in some ways than women, but it was hard to turn that off and then become a compassionate person. They just were, and I had struggled with those two being in conflict. So. Right.
Yeah. And I think you're definitely right. Being in that state of mind and just having that attitude, also in my experience, will prepare you for bigger acts of compassion. And you see that like through people's actions. So yeah, I love everything about that. And I know that you have some work and you have some books. So if you want to talk about that, I'm sure our audience would love to hear about that.
Sure. Well, I wrote a book for adults called Compassion Magic, and it's basically my journey through the challenges in my life and through the caregiving of my husband, and how I learned through compassion, I healed, and then I was able to thrive. And it's a personal journey, but part of why I wrote that is not because I think I'm so important people should read about what I've been through, but the idea that I think if we are going to connect, and compassion is a huge connector, we need to be vulnerable with each other, right? We can't go around with this image of ourselves as always perfect and always have everything together and don't need anything. I think we need to show who we really are with all of our fears and, quirks and foibles and all of that. So the idea is I really honestly tell my story, and I'm hoping that through that you'll connect and maybe you will share your story authentically with other people in your life. And we can become much more authentic in our interactions with each other. But, and it's also about compassion, how I didn't find much when we were going through this and how, I healed through that. But there's a lot of other stories too in there about all kinds of experiences that I hope people can relate to and maybe help them heal.
Yeah, and you have Superhero Sam Saves His Family. Is that one book or a series, or? Well,
it's going to be a series. I only have one right now, but the idea was I wanted to have, and it's gender neutral and ethnically diverse in the illustrations. So the idea is that I wanted a superhero that was rewarded for showing things like compassion, kindness, thoughtfulness. And so this is a little boy or a little girl, Sam or Samantha, that, changes how he interacts with his parents and starts to be kind and thoughtful, and they start to connect with each other more and to have a happier family life. And so his mom, for a variety of reasons, his mom tells him he or she is a superhero, and she makes him a superhero costume. And so he wears a C on his chest for compassion superhero.
Oh, cool. So that's, you have two books, and you said, so in the future we can expect more in that series?
Yes, yes. So this is Sam with his family, but he'll be at school, or Sam or Samantha. I may branch them off, but yes, there will be other places where Sam or Samantha will have an opportunity to show compassion, and rather than with his family. That's just kind of the starting point.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I think that's a great role model, a great example for kids, something that is definitely needed, especially now, with, the way in our day and age, we need to show more compassion.
Well, and the kids who are compassionate still aren't held in very high esteem, mm-hmm. right, in our culture. Mm-hmm. Whether I'm not saying with teachers, but with their peers, right?
Right.
They're just not. So how do we change that dynamic?
Oh, cool.
To get it to where the compassionate kid is the someone everybody wants to be like.
Right. Like those are the values and virtues that that kids should aspire to when they see it. And how do we foster that?
Yes. And this is hopefully an attempt to start fostering that.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And I know you have a talk in Chicago that's coming up.
Right. There's a caregivers conference in Chicago in November. You can attend virtually, which is what I love about this. But it's going to be all kinds of people in the field of caregiving, talking on a variety of subjects to people who are in the healthcare industry. So, or family caregivers or professional caregivers or anybody in the healthcare industry, just the idea of, and I'm going to be talking about alleviating and preventing burnout, but there's a variety of topics that I think might appeal to someone who's in the healthcare field. And like I said, you can attend virtually. You don't have to go to Chicago. Mm-hmm. So I would just suggest it's caregiver.com. If you plug that into your internet, then you're going to be able to, it should pull up the conference, but if somebody can't find it, please, they can contact me through my webpage, compassionmagic.com, and then I'll be happy to email them the link to it so that they can check it out.
Oh, cool. Okay, perfect. And do you have, so where can people find you?
So my website is compassionmagic.com. You can find me on Facebook too. If you like my page, it's just under my name, Virginia. My middle name is Hunter because there's more Virginia Sampsons, believe it or not. So it's Virginia Hunter, Hunter Sampson. That's with a P on Facebook. I'd love it if you'd like my page. I post things about compassion, articles. I write for Thrive Global too, and a couple other publications, so I'll post some of my articles on there. But the best way to access me is probably my webpage, Compassion Magic, because then you can find all my links to social media. And you can send me a message from there if you're interested in any of these handouts. I'm happy to give them, or more information about the conference. I'd love to hear from people. I'd love to hear people's stories. I'm trying to get a bulletin board up where people can share their stories. Mm-hmm. And what they're going through. And, we can have a little community of compassion, not even related to healthcare, just daily life. So I'm kind of working on that. That isn't up yet, but that's in the works.
Oh, I love that. Okay, so I have one final question, and it's my little signature question. What makes you your most lit up self?
I'd say connecting with people. Mm-hmm. And that's what I love about when I talk about compassion or I, try to train people, is that I connect with them, because that's a subject and a topic that gets people vulnerable and gets them to open up, and we get some meaningful connections. So I would say that's for now is really what I like. And that's why I like my law practice. I do that with my clients too, because they're seniors, they're vulnerable. So you really get to connect with them on a deeper level. And that's what I really like. I love it. I love the connections.
Oh, awesome. That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, and I will share all of your links and everything with my audience on the show notes.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope you'll stay in touch with me.
Thanks so much for listening. Like what you're hearing? Subscribe to our podcast, rate, and write a review on iTunes. It would mean the world to us. We come out with new and exciting content each week that will help you slay your burnout beast. So share the show with your friends and your coworkers so we can build a better healthcare industry together. Thanks again.